Hi, I want to talk to you about nightmares today and what we do as coaches when a client brings us a nightmare. Now, these experiences are not particularly pleasant. When you have a nightmare, usually what happens is you get so frightened in the dream that you wake up. And when you wake up, your heart rate is accelerated, you're maybe breaking out in cold sweats. And there's a period of disorientation where you're really not sure if you're still in the nightmare and if it was real or not. So, why would an experience like that be extraordinarily useful? Well, hopefully I'll be able to explain that to you in the next 10 or 15 minutes. It's interesting that human beings will pay to be frightened. You can jump off a bridge on a bungee cord. You can jump out of an airplane with a parachute. You can go to a scary movie. You can go to an amusement park and get on the roller coaster. And all of these things, we actually part with our money to have the experience. And the experience is to be frightened in an exhilarating way. And the difference between a nightmare and an experience like that is you know you're going to get scared. You know the whole point of getting on that roller coaster is to have that exhilarating experience. But nightmares are unpredictable. You didn't ask for them. You certainly didn't pay for them. So when they show up, they can be very disconcerting. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we listen to a nightmare. It's a subject for a different video in terms of listening to dreams in general, but let's understand there's sort of three levels. One is we want to listen to the story, and then we want to listen to the emotional arc of that story, which becomes very important when you're listening to a nightmare. And the third thing we want to listen for is the metaphors in either the story or the emotional arc. So the best way for me to describe this, as always, is to give you an example. There's a woman who participated in one of my workshops who had the following dream. She was in a van and she was driving on a country road that she knew, where she used to live in Virginia. And in the van, in the back, were her two sons. One's 14 and one is 16. And everything's going fine. And then all of a sudden, she hits a traffic jam and nothing is moving in either direction. And she waits and she waits and she waits. And then finally, she asks her older son to get out and see what's happening. And he does. And he doesn't come back. And he doesn't come back and he doesn't come back. And so at some point, she turns off the car, gets out, walks around the back of the van, and there in the street is a body. And her initial reaction is that it's her son. And then she looks closer and she sees, no, it's not her son, but there are bodies underneath this body, and her son might be there. And then she gets so frightened, she wakes up. Okay, so we know what the story of this dream is. But then when we ask her, what's the emotional arc of the dream? Here's how it plays out. The first part is frustration, can't move. The second part is action, asking her son to get out and find out what's going on. And the third part is disaster. So frustration, action, disaster. Now, at this point, it's always useful to say, well, okay, if we look at that, does that resonate in any area of your life? Does that remind you of something? And interestingly enough, she said, yeah, pretty much my life. Certainly the level of frustration and that nothing is moving. And what we're seeing in this dream is this underlying conviction that if any action is taken, it will result in something horrific. And that is the point of what the dreamer has set up in this nightmare, because whether or not you're a parent, you know that the loss of a child is probably the most nightmarish experience you could have ever. And so that has been inserted in this dream. Why? Because the dreamer is basically trying to get your attention. Okay? So there may have been dreams before, there will certainly be dreams afterwards, where there's a refinement of what that fear is. But what's happened in this nightmare is you're getting the full force, the full dramatic force of the worst thing that could possibly happen in your life to illustrate the level of fear that you may have about moving against your frustration in this case. So what we can see is that the story in and of itself and the emotions in and of themselves don't really convey the full picture until we get a sense of how this applies to someone's life. And at that point, that fear becomes understandable. Now we can see that there's a reason why someone isn't moving forward, because there's a concern about something that will happen. And it seems like there's a concern about something that will happen within the family. And without going into any detail about this woman's life, I can tell you that the dream was at least in part a catalyst to shake things up and move things around. So nightmares, in a way, are extraordinarily valuable dreams because they're very dramatic. And one of the things that's important for a coach to understand is that that emotional impact, that terror, when you wake up, is something to respect, obviously, but it is not the point of the nightmare, okay? The point of the nightmare is not to terrorize you. The point of the nightmare is to get you to see an emotional construct that you're carrying around with yourself that you're probably about to outgrow. So I always see nightmares as a gift. I mean, people in social situations either tell me, oh, I don't want to deal with my dreams, they're weird, which is like, as opposed to what? Of course they're weird. Or I don't want to deal with my dreams because they're nightmares, in which case I feel like, well, it's somewhat urgent because there's a message that is trying to get through to you from yourself about what your situation is. And the only reason that message is coming through is because you're now ready to take it on. You're now ready to step into that fear. And when you do that, just like when you use active imagination to go back into a dream around something that was frightening, that fear is really a gateway to transformation. Because in our culture, we have sort of two general sets of emotions in the popular culture. One's depression, the other one is anxiety. So one is regret about the past, the other one is regret about the future. And they're real. I'm not suggesting that they're cooked up even remotely. From a spiritual sense, people who are in those states generally are getting ready. In other words, the field is fallow. They can't really hook into anything, but they need the time out. Okay? That's one way of looking at those two states. They're difficult to deal with in terms of any kind of action in a coaching process because they're so diffuse, right? There's not the sharpness of fear in those in depression or anxiety. And we need that sharp emotion to move forward. So fear is a transformative emotion. It doesn't seem like it's so pleasant, and it's not, to experience it. But to get into it and walk through it and understand it from the standpoint of what it's trying to say to you is really very powerful. So my message to you really is that not to be afraid of nightmares, not to be afraid of the powerful emotion that a client will bring in and the disorientation and the concern about even dealing with the dream. Because one of the things we want to say to those clients is, look, this is your lucky day. It really is. Because we're going to get some insight here and you're going to make a move based on what your soul is trying to tell you. I'm Will Sharon. I hope that was useful.